History often remembers the battles, the treaties, and the leaders. But what about those caught between worlds? What about the women taken captive, whose lives became a bridge between two civilizations? The history of native and colonial conflict was not just written in blood, it was shaped by the people who lived through it, by the captives who walked the line between war and survival. The clashes between settlers and native nations were brutal, often ending in death or capture. But captivity was not always what outsiders imagined. Among native societies, prisoners, whether taken from enemy tribes or from the white settlers, were often treated the same. There was no special cruelty reserved for outsiders. Captivity was a practice with deep roots, shaped by necessity, tradition, and sometimes even mercy. Some captives became kin, fully embraced as members of the tribe. Others lived in a limbo, waiting for ransom, their fate hanging in the balance. This is a story rarely told, a history often overlooked. Today, we step into the past and see through native eyes how they viewed captive women, how they treated them, and what it meant to be taken, not just as a prisoner, but as a potential daughter, wife, or warrior in a new world. When two worlds collided, the cost was measured in blood, land, and lives. The clash between native nations and European colonizers was more than just a struggle for territory. It was a battle for survival, identity, and the future of entire peoples. In the chaos of war, not all captives shared the same fate. Some were taken as hostages, their lives held as bargaining chips in fragile negotiations. Others met a far grimmer end, subjected to slow and agonizing deaths, a fate often reserved for warriors, seen as threats to the survival of the tribe. And yet, for some, captivity was not a death sentence, but an unexpected transformation. Children, too young to be seen as enemies, often faced one of two stark realities. Some perished in the brutality of war, their fate sealed the moment they were caught in a raid. But those who survived were given a different path, one that led not to servitude, but to adoption. Many were raised not as prisoners, but as full members of the tribe, their old lives fading into distant memory. For them, captivity was not an end, but a new beginning. History records one of the earliest instances of European captivity in the story of Álvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca and his companions, who found themselves prisoners in what is now Texas. Yet unlike many who met their demise, these men lived, adapted, and, in time, were not just tolerated, but respected. They were not seen merely as outsiders, but as individuals with knowledge and skills that made them valuable. Their survival was not just luck, it was a testament to the complexity of native societies, where captives could become something more than just prisoners. This is the reality of war world, where fate was never written in stone, where survival depended not just on strength, but on the willingness to embrace something new. Captivity in times of war often meant suffering, but for some, it opened a door to an entirely new way of life. Among the native nations, captives were not always prisoners in the way outsiders imagined. Some found themselves respected, valued, and even honored not because of where they came from, but because of what they could contribute. Men who possessed knowledge, especially in healing, were often given unexpected opportunities. Álvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca and his companions, held captive in what is now Texas, did not simply survive, they thrived. Their understanding of medicine, their ability to heal, made them indispensable. They walked freely, held in esteem rather than in chains. They were not merely tolerated, they were elevated. Women taken captive faced fates that ranged from tragic to transformative. Many might assume they were treated harshly, but in truth, young girls, especially those taken at an early age, were often embraced by their new communities. In many cases, they were not just accepted, they were cherished. Some rose to positions of influence, not as outsiders, but as true members of the tribe. The story of Cynthia Ann Parker is one of the most well-known. Taken as a child, she did not just survive among the Comanche, she became one of them. She married Petanocona, a respected chief, and gave birth to Quanah Parker, the last great Comanche military leader. When she was found in 1860 and forced back to white society, she resisted, attempting multiple times to escape and return to the people she considered her true family. Her story is not unique. Millie Durgan, another child taken in war, was raised among the Kiowa, married a warrior, and remained with them for the rest of her life, living happily into old age. These were not women held against their will. They were women who had become part of something greater. Captivity, for many, was not an end, it was a transformation. It was a path from war to belonging, from fear to family, from prisoner to kin. Not all captives embraced their new lives. For some, captivity was not a path to belonging. It was a wound that never healed. While many were adopted into native communities and found acceptance, others, especially those taken as adolescents, carried a deep and unshakable hatred for their captors. They did not forget. They did not forgive. And some, like Matilda Lockhart, burned with a desire for revenge. Taken by the Comanche at the age of 13, Matilda returned to white society years later, scarred both physically and emotionally. Instead, they were forced into a life of servitude, their days spent gathering food and collecting firewood. In 1840, at the San Antonio Council House, negotiations between Comanche leaders and Texas officials turned deadly after Matilda revealed the brutal treatment she had endured. What was meant to be a peaceful exchange erupted into bloodshed, exposing the reality that many captives, both native and settler, were still held against their will. Yet, within many native societies, violence against female captives was neither condoned nor accepted. The moral codes of various tribes placed strict boundaries on how captives, especially women and children, were treated. War was brutal, but it had rules. If a captive did not wish to stay, they were often ransomed back to their families. If they chose to remain, they could marry into the tribe, not as prisoners, but as kin. Captivity was never a single story. For some, it meant survival. For others, it meant suffering. But for all, it was a moment that shaped the fate of two worlds caught in an unstoppable collision. In the world of war and survival, captives were more than prisoners. They were part of a complex system of diplomacy, kinship, and survival. Women, in particular, were not merely taken as spoils of war, but were often seen as valuable members of the community. Many were integrated into tribal life, not through force, but through a system that valued their presence. Captured women were sometimes ransomed back to their families, but others found new lives within the tribe. The exchange of captives became an established practice, facilitated by intermediaries who negotiated their return. Yet, one of the most misunderstood aspects of this history is that native tribes did not force captives to stay. If a captive wished to leave, they could do so once their family paid the ransom. But if they chose to stay, they were not merely tolerated, they became part of something greater. Young girls, in particular, were often welcomed into the household of the chief, where they were given a place of honor, strength, resilience, and the ability to bring forth future generations were qualities deeply respected among native nations. Over time, this practice became a ritual, where the most skilled warriors were granted the right to marry into the chief's family, forging bonds that strengthened the tribe. The story of Cynthia Ann Parker is a testament to this truth. Captured as a child, she was raised as a Comanche, married Petanocona, and became the mother of Quanah Parker, one of the greatest Comanche leaders in history. Even when she was later taken back by white settlers, she longed to return to the people who had become her true family. She was not a prisoner. She was Comanche. Captivity was never a simple fate. It was a crossroads, a choice, a transformation. Some left, some stayed, but those who remained did so because they found something many would never understand: belonging. What makes a home? Is it the land where you were born, or the people who welcome you as their own? For some captives, the answer was not what history would have us believe. Many women taken into native communities found something unexpected: not chains, but belonging. To outsiders, life among the tribes may have seemed primitive, but for some, it offered a kind of freedom and respect that so-called civilized societies did not. Women who once lived under strict European norms found themselves in cultures where they had voices, roles, and a place among the people. Cynthia Ann Parker understood this more than anyone. Though she was taken as a child, she grew into a Comanche woman, a wife, a mother. When Texas Rangers recaptured her in 1860, they believed they were saving her. But to Cynthia, it was a prison. She never stopped longing for the home she had found. And when she died, she wanted to rest where her heart had always belonged, among her Comanche family. But not all captives had the same fate. The Oatman Massacre tells another story, one of tragedy, survival, and the complexities of war. In 1851, the Oatman family traveled west, seeking a new life in California. They never made it. Yavapai warriors attacked their wagon train, sparing only 3: Olive Oatman, Mary Ann Oatman, and their wounded brother, Lorenzo Oatman. Lorenzo was left for dead, but survived to tell the story. While the 2 sisters were taken, their fate was a reminder of the brutal realities of frontier life. Captivity was never one story. It was not always suffering, nor was it always salvation. For some, it was a cruel fate. For others, it was the beginning of something new. But for all, it was a choice that history has too often misunderstood. For a year, Olive and Mary Ann Oatman lived in the shadow of fear. The world they had known was gone, their family slaughtered, their future uncertain. After the massacre, their fate was unknown until whispers of their captivity began to surface. Buried beneath the sands of time was the truth. The sisters had been taken by a tribe, not as guests, but as captives. They were not welcomed, nor were they given the chance to integrate. Instead, they were forced into a life of servitude. Their days spent gathering food and collecting firewood. Their hands bore the marks of their suffering, burned from the hot sticks they were made to carry. Children mocked them, while adults met them with cruelty. For Olive, the fear was constant. She knew that at any moment, she or her sister could be killed. Unlike others who had been adopted into native families, she was not embraced. She was a prisoner, held against her will, waiting for a fate she could not control. But fate, as always, had other plans. After nearly a year of suffering, a new people arrived, the Mojave. Their presence would change everything. For Olive and Mary Ann Oatman, everything changed the moment the Mojave arrived. Trade was common between tribes, an exchange of goods, knowledge, and sometimes people. When the Mojave leaders saw the 2 captive sisters, they did something unexpected. They ransomed them, not as commodities, but as children in need of a home. Gone were the days of forced labor and cruelty. Chief Espinola, his wife, and their daughter Topeka welcomed Olive and Mary Ann as family. No longer prisoners, they were embraced with love and care, treated not as outsiders, but as daughters. Unlike the harsh treatment they had endured before, Olive would later recall that the Mojave showed them more kindness than their own people ever had. But true acceptance in the tribe required more than just words. As a mark of their place among the Mojave, they were tattooed an honor, a bond, a sign that they belonged. These inked patterns were not just symbols on their skin, but a declaration that they were no longer captives, they were Mojave. Though settlers often passed through Mojave lands, neither Olive nor Mary Ann ever called for rescue. They had no need to. They were not prisoners, not anymore. But fate, as always, had other plans. A drought came, food grew scarce, and hunger took Mary Ann's life. Around the same time, a visitor traveling through noticed Olive, her pale skin. her blue eyes, her presence among the Mojave. Word spread quickly. The U.S. military sent a message. They wanted her back. The Mojave hesitated. They knew what would happen next. Some tried to hide her, hoping to keep her safe in the only home she had left. But the world beyond the desert was already closing in. The soldiers did not come to negotiate. They came with threats. If Olive was not handed over, the entire Mojave settlement would be destroyed. The choice was never truly hers. To save their people, the Mojave had no option but to let her go. Mary Ann was gone. Now, Olive was alone. At 19, she was no longer the girl taken years ago. She had been Mojave longer than she had been Oatman. Her identity was no longer tied to the settlers who had abandoned her. She had a home. She had a family. And now, she was being forced to leave it behind. The Mojave had tried to protect her, instructing her to conceal her origins. They told her to say she was not American, but a distant people who shared blood with the tribes. Cynthia Ann Parker understood this more than anyone. It wasn't deception, it was survival. But Olive refused to lie. When questioned, she spoke not with the fluency of a settler, but in broken English, the language now foreign to her tongue. She told the truth. The military official, Francisco, was enraged. To him, there was no room for a white woman who had chosen another life. For speaking out, she was nearly killed. The merchants, furious at her defiance, prepared to execute her, seeing her words as betrayal. But the Mojave stood by her, shielding her once more, even as she was torn from them. She was returned to her brother, Lorenzo Oatman, and to the world of the settlers. But she did not return as the girl they had lost. She returned as someone they could never fully understand. Years passed. She married, she lived, but she never truly smiled again. Those who knew her whispered that her heart had remained with the Mojave, with the husband and children she had left behind. History would call her a rescued captive. But those who truly looked at her saw something else. Not a prisoner freed, but a woman exiled from the only home she had ever chosen.